I'm Richard Goodwin. I'm the Managing Director of the JGA Group, and this session is to discover systems thinking. Martin, can you flick the slide, please? We'll take you just 30 seconds on who we are and why we're talking. Then Martin Parr, Professor Martin Parr, will be talking you through what is systems thinking and through some instances of how it can be applied in an A&E optimization scenario, and also an example of one of the systems thinking tools, a multi-criteria decision analysis framework. At the end, my colleague Rich Burgess will take you through a few of the training options, and then it'll be open season on questions for the last 5, 10, 15 minutes, depending on how we do for time. Ideally, if you could save your questions for the end, I think that would be great, or put them in the chat. Actually, the best thing is if you can put your questions in the chat as they arise, then they can be dealt with either at the end or when it's convenient for the speaker. Great. Martin, thank you. A little bit about us. We're what's known as an independent training provider. That means we generally operate in the government-funded space. We do apprenticeships and we do short courses. A good provider. We have lots of long-term contracts, national contracts with the government, and we're national market leader in at least 4 of our apprenticeships. Systems thinking is one of the apprenticeships we offer, in addition to short courses in some of the disciplines within systems thinking, and we'll talk a little more about that at the end. We're a good provider, I think, by whatever definition you have. We won the Queen's Award for Enterprise last year for promoting opportunity. We win lots of awards, and we are growing fast. Thank you, Martin. Next will be Professor Martin Parr talking to you, and he's done a lot of work, particularly in the public sector, applying systems thinking principles to complex or wicked, as they say in the terminology, problems. Some of the other people who work on the programme, Candy Perry, Julian Starkey. Candy in particular has a lot of health service experience. Julian works with other bits of the public sector, defence and Sport England and so forth. And on that, I leave you with Professor Martin Parr. Thank you, Martin.
Thanks, Richard. That's great. So I'll talk you through a bit about systems thinking and how it can really make things happen. In the world of systems thinking, we deal with decision making in complex environments. And these are, as Richard said, traditionally referred to as wicked problems. So the kind of problems where there's no obvious way forward. I mean, a classic example of a wicked problem is world peace. That's a particularly wicked problem. But there are lots of those sorts of problems where it's really difficult to know how to take a sort of a single step. I mean, in the example of world peace, people might say, well, disarmament, if you disarm, we should end up with a more peaceful world. But certainly if one person disarms, history has been quite sort of keen to point out that there's the chances of being invaded are pretty high. So disarmament on its own is definitely not likely to lead to world peace if it's only you who's disarming. So systems thinking is about thinking about the overall behavior of a system. How does the system really work? How do the elements of that system work? What's the system part of? What are the parts of it? And how can we start to influence that system and adjust that system? The public sector is full of these kinds of wicked problems, everything from provision of healthcare within a region through to the way that the economy works. There are a whole lot of wicked problems out there, and I'm sure you're all familiar with that type of problem. So the difficulty in a complex problem is really around getting agreement to what and how. And you might think with something like, for example, Brexit, getting agreement to what and how from a few people would be relatively straightforward. I mean, let's face it, ever since 2016, in every pub, length and breadth of the land, there will be someone telling you how to do Brexit. But unfortunately, that's just a few people. What you need is the decision makers, all of them, to agree to a way forward. That's somewhat more difficult. And a lot of the problems arise because the decision maker can't make sense of the decision space. We've all been in that situation of being bombarded with information, evidence, data, there's tons of it around. Your mailbox fills up with masses of it. Every time you want to go and research a new area, you find that there's vast amounts of sales leaflets, there's vast amounts of information drifting around. But how do you make sense of that? What's the way of trying to figure out what you do and how you go forward? The classic human reaction to that sort of situation, particularly when we're under pressure, is just reach for a solution. Nobody likes being in a situation where we don't have solutions. So it's natural to go and reach for a solution. But this has a real sting in its tail that tends to move the problem around at best. It certainly doesn't tend to solve it. You might say, well, across government, we do our best, we do what we can. Is this really that big a problem? I think this graph makes the scale of the issue pretty clear. So this is the Infrastructure and Projects Authority review of the major projects which are run across government. So this is every big project that's run in any government department. And the number changes quite markedly. So we've been down at one point in 2020, we were down to 125 major projects run across the departments. We're now up to a lot, so 235. So essentially, it's really down to a sort of discussion as to what constitutes a major project, but financial budget will be quite a lot of that consideration. And this review looks at grading of those projects. So they're graded all the way through from green, where essentially everything is on track. I haven't copied that one in, but essentially successful delivery is highly likely. You've got then sort of amber, green, amber, all the way through to red. Red says that successful delivery is really unachievable. So you would expect, really, if we're pouring in total of about 0.6 of £1 trillion into these whole life cost. So, a decent chunk of £1 trillion is a vast amount of money for a country the size of the UK. So if we're spending that sort of money on all of these projects, you would expect it to be a sea of green, but it's not. It's kind of a sea of amber with a reasonable amount of red and some amount of green. The grey ones are not classified. They're essentially not released. So there are certain projects like the upgrade to Trident, for example, in the Ministry of Defence, where we're not going to tell anybody how that's going. It's interesting to see how many of those there are in each year. But projects within the NHS, for example, would be the new hospitals programme. So that is a major project run as a major project. Clearly, as a major project, it has the best resource, it has the best people, it has vast interest. And if you are the senior responsible owner of a major project and your project changes colour, particularly if it goes towards the left-hand side of this, you're going to be very quickly hearing from some senior people across government. So these have huge amounts of attention, so you would expect there'll be a lot of work done on them. My question is, what about those that are not being observed? If we're observing these so carefully, if we're so keen to make sure that these projects run well, and we still don't have a sea of green here, what about all the projects that don't register on this scale? How well are they doing? So my suggestion is that systems thinking can make quite a difference here. It's not a magic wand, it's not a panacea, it's not something that's going to change every single one of these. But what it might do is it might stop some of them before they head off the rails. There was a very classic case many years ago of the Nimrod, where I think it was like in the late 90s, we signed up the procurement for it. And the original intention was to buy 27 aircraft. And every time that the project ran into problems, they just carved off a number of aircraft that were being ordered, until eventually we got down to 9. And I think it was then in 2003 the whole thing was canned. We'd spent 3.4 billion on that. Just think of how many hospitals you could build for that money. Think about all the the improvements you could make to cancer care, and all we'd done with that 3.4 billion was to pay it to a contractor and end up with some scrap steel and perhaps a bit of know-how in the supply community. So we do really have to think carefully about what we do at the outset. And probably the best thing with Nimrod would have been what they've had to do later on, which is find an off-the-shelf solution. So systems thinking can help us to hone in on those really critical, really important decisions and try and make sure that the route that we take is most appropriate. So what can systems thinking help with in totality? It can help with complexity, not knowing what to do, all the competing issues, all the pressures. Political pressure. I'm sure that many of you on this call have experienced political pressure. I certainly have in all the years that I've worked in and with the civil service. There's a whole lot of people wanting different solutions. There are very often too many chiefs all wanting their own directions. There's vast amounts of time pressure. People really set a very aggressive timescale against many of these projects. There is in general a lack of funding, a lack of support, a lack of engagement. And then ultimately, of course, if you put a project run under traditional sort of conditions like that, you'll get to a point where you just burn people out. You know, they've run out of money, time, ideas, energy, all of that. So what does systems thinking really do? What's the approach? I've talked about it in terms of helping and dealing with some of these big projects, but what do we really do? The best description that I can give you is that it's about walking a journey of managing really complex issues. So at the outset of that journey, the big question is, what is the issue? One of the classic mistakes that's made is often leaping in and solving the wrong problem fairly well. So we want to make sure that we're dealing with the right problem at the beginning. And there are a whole variety of tools which allow us to figure out, well, what is the thing that is the issue? One stakeholder will refer to it in one way. For example, an HR director might say, well, we've got a problem with a culture around here. The finance director might say, oh, I've got a problem making money. The marketing director might say, well, we've just got a real big problem. If we can get past this hurdle in marketing, we'll be there. So which one of them is right? Well, there's probably an element of the solution in all of these, but there also may be an amount of give and take. So the first part of this, the yellow part, is finding a broad direction. So what could we do? What might be possible? What are the moving parts in this? Then we look at options. What could be the range of acceptable options? And then within those options, how do we hone and refine and select an option that fits the bill for this? And then ultimately, how do we bring it into purpose? So we move from a very soft world of who's worried about this, who cares, what can we do, through to the real hard world of writing software, digging holes in the ground, etc., to realize a system, to bring something into being. And walking that journey is very important. A lot of people leap from left to right of that without really properly taking account of what needs to be done. And actually walking the journey isn't particularly resource intensive. You can do that on a smallish project in a matter of days if you need to. You can do it for very, very little expense. It's a tiny fraction of a budget, and particularly with those big projects, where we're talking of multi-billion pound budgets, it's absolutely minute in comparison with the cost of the project. It can make really huge differences to the way that it's delivered. So that's a very general overview, but what does this mean in practice? Let's look at a hospital. So accident and emergency. So a problem that we're all kind of familiar with, that the accident and emergency departments tend to be really busy. They tend to be very full, especially at the moment. And what can you do to improve that? Well, the problem is not just in accident and emergency. The problem is that you have to be able to generate a flow through the hospital. If you've got no beds to discharge anybody to, well, there's nothing much that you can do. A&E is just going to fill up and fill up and fill up. So it becomes a whole hospital problem, but which becomes a whole healthcare problem, because in order to get people out of hospital, you've got to discharge them to somewhere. So that sort of comes into being. In thinking about this, I would encourage, well, I always have encouraged all of the learners on this program to think in terms of three different worlds. And you might say, what's this leap into philosophy? Or what we do within this course is all very practical stuff. So I only bring, a snippet of elements of philosophy and things where they're really useful and really practical and usable immediately. This comes from Habermas. Habermas talks about three worlds: the material world, the social world, and the personal world. And my question is, do we focus on all three? I've known one case where a hospital chief executive did the most fantastic job in the material world, complete optimization of where everything was, even right down to figuring out when a patient was likely to leave hospital and making sure all the pharmacy work, which normally takes sort of a day or more, all of that was done well in advance. So the sort of all the medicines were just literally waiting for the moment the patient was discharged. Totally beautiful job in the material world. You couldn't fault it. Of course, the first thing that happened was the porters said, well, I don't want people telling me where to push my trolley to. I know what I'm doing. I've been doing this job for some while. The nurses revolted, and then, of course, it all came to a head when the consultants decided that it wasn't for them either. So the personal world and the social world were not really attended to as well. I would say that if we're going to do a thorough solution to this, we need to think about all of them. Let's look at a situation where we can sort of hone in on on these in a bit more detail. The material world is about helping the flow of patients through the system, getting the right people into the right place to enable that flow. The personal world is really helping individuals to see changes being made with them, not to them. It's very important that the staff feel that they're part of that journey. And the social world is really about essentially handling the culture sensitively, dealing with all of the cultural issues that we know will pop up. Of course, as a chief executive of a hospital trust, your biggest challenge is when a consultant says, well, no, I'm sorry, I'm just not going to do this, because you do need your consultants. Maybe if one leaves, you might just be able to cover it, but if you lose the odd few, that's a massive dent in your capability. So making sure that things fit with the culture of the organisation is absolutely essential. In the case of the Cambridge University hospitals, a real significant turnaround was applied using systems thinking approaches. So if we go back to January 2015, the trust was in special measures. Essentially, they were not meeting their targets, and they were finding they were cancelling 500 operations a month. It's just beyond belief. I mean, 500 operations, 500 people being told you can't, we can't do your routine surgery, today. Sorry, you've got to rebook and come back another time. By 2017, they'd made a massive improvement in that. The A&E patient stay was reduced by 7%. Doesn't sound like very much, but actually it's one of those little differences that can make a really big difference to the whole system. They'd hit their target for the time that patients spent in A&E, and they got to a point where less than 50 operations were cancelled a month, so 10 times less than 2 years before. So a massive difference in that time, and they've gone from being in special measures to to good and outstanding in some places. So how did that turnaround take place? Let's look at it in terms of the three worlds. So in the material world, the world that we often just reach for, the world that's probably the most comfortable to reach for often, they've employed new tools to improve patient flow, efficiencies. They've looked at ways of being able to fill gaps in recruitment very quickly with the right people, so improving that process. Being more proactive on risk assessment and improvements, increasing ambulatory care pathways, so allowing people a pathway to care without necessarily sort of always going through the same route. And then a new medical decision unit. So essentially improving and enhancing the medical decision making process, so making it sort of more slick. And then ultimately improving discharge pathways through community care. So reaching out not just to the system that this is part of, but to a broader system, to the community. So that's the material world transformation. What about the personal world? Staff were actually given time to reflect. Reflection time became key. Influence was essential, and essentially they were able to sort of look at their own experience. The staff were able to identify those areas for improvement and try and get them actioned. There was a genuine atmosphere of investment where the seniors, the leaders, the doctors, etc., were all participating in a program to sort of move away. So they moved away from the kind of traditional hierarchy where people were just told what to do by their seniors, and actually they were trying to make decisions at the right level. Getting decision making down to the right level was absolutely crucial. And ultimately, inviting feedback from all, getting feedback and owning and building those changes, so that people felt that they were being taken on that journey rather than it being done to them. Ultimately, then in the social world, getting acceptance at the CQC findings, getting acceptance at where they were, and that's really the first stage of any change, any transformation activity. Then essentially getting the executives to take responsibility, and the teams then to form up beneath those executives to sort of take forward that focus and make sure that value was being delivered within each area. Improving everything across the hospital, including clinical and non-clinical areas, and then making sure that staff were represented and involved. Sharing success stories. Success stories are so vital. They kind of keep us going. If you feel that you're part of something that's that's successful and is moving forward, then it's a very powerful place to be. Shifting the emphasis from finance to quality. So getting the people out of the sort of mindset of, well, how's the spreadsheet doing, to really looking at, well, how are we genuinely doing? Are we managing infections properly? Are we managing flow of patients through? What's the patient experience, etc. And then ultimately moving from command and control to contribute and improve. I mean, that's really a shift in culture. So the traditional sort of culture within that trust, certainly, and in other parts of the NHS, is very much around command and control, the sort of classic hierarchy that you'll find in the the police, the army, etc. But that hierarchy serves you very well, particularly in the military. It serves you very well on a battlefield. It doesn't do quite so well for delivering healthcare across a community. So those were the changes that essentially led to the turnaround, and 2 years is a pretty impressive time to perform that level of turnaround. So that's one example of where systems thinking can make a real and sustained difference in the NHS. Let's look at another example. I'm going to give you some an approach here from systems thinking, which will be useful to you in a whole variety of different areas. So I'm hoping today that you'll be able to take away an approach that will help you in some decision making work. The example I'm going to give is one that we'll all be able to relate to. You've got an old car, and you need to find a more modern car, but you want an evidence-based approach. So very similar to the sorts of decision making that you may be involved in implementing a new system in your work, or a sort of should we opt to change, and if so, what strategy should we adopt? All of those kind of decisions can be made using this approach. This isn't the only approach, but this is one that the learners really appreciate on this course. Let's imagine that we've got 3 elements of our decision to make for a good car. The elements are colour, brand attractiveness, and performance. And so one of those elements lends itself quite well to being able to be made using data. So it's a hard input. In performance terms, you could say, if you were Jeremy Clarkson, well, if it does 0 to 60 in, I don't know, 3 seconds or whatever, whatever Jeremy Clarkson would find appealing, then it's great. If it'll do 0 to 60 in 8 seconds, I might just about have it. If it'll do 0 to 60 in 13 seconds and more, I'll just forget it, bin it. So you could make that decision purely on hard data, on the numbers. But colour and brand attractiveness, you can't. So if you're going to make a decision in your sort of workplace to adopt a particular approach, and you want to make it using an evidence-based activity, then the colour and brand attractiveness elements don't really lend themselves too well to sort of applying numbers to them. But this approach lets us take a very clear and actually very scientifically robust approach. People have sometimes sort of said to me, well, does this really hold? Can you actually use this? Oh, I used it to make about £120 million worth of decision not very long ago in the public sector. So, and that went through an independent scrutiny team, and they were completely satisfied with this. So the approach is robust. You have to apply it in certain ways, and we'll cover that on the course. But this approach in itself is absolutely robust. So the first thing that you do in multi-criteria decision analysis, MCDA, is you will apply judgment onto those links. And that means, well, what weight do we apportion to each of these areas. And let's, again, to make life really easy for ourselves on this simple example, let's apply a third. So we're saying that each of these is equally important. That might not be the case. We might put more store on brand attractiveness, we might put more store on performance, but just for this example, let's put a third onto each one. We can now bring in some options. So we'll bring in a Volkswagen, a relatively sort of middle of the road option as a new car. And what we need in order to be able to work with this is we need a scoring scale. And I've outlined the bare bones of one on the right hand side, which is, can be fleshed out. You might well have a lot more detail about what a 10 and a 9 and an 8, etc. Equate to, and what you would expect out of each of those options. But again, just to make life really simple for us, 5 is acceptable, 10 is ideal, 0 has no benefit. And so what we're saying, and we can do this by committee, we can have a whole lot of people engaged in this, and we can do some quite fancy analysis if we need to on the results. But let's say we've reached consensus as a scoring committee, and we've said that colour is a bit better than acceptable, so we've given it a 6. Brand attractiveness is acceptable, so we've given it a 5, and performance is acceptable as well, so we've given that a 5. So let's hop to the lower end of the scale. Classic public sector procurement. We've got to look at, the cheapest possible. So let's go and have a look at a Trabant. So in terms of performance, it does 0 to 60 only if you throw it off a cliff. So the performance is definitely not good there. Brand attractiveness of a Trabant, well, I don't think it rates very high in this day and age. Maybe for historic value, perhaps. And colour, let's just suppose, again, for the sake of illustration, that our scoring committee really don't like blue cars. I do apologise to everybody out there who's a fan of blue cars. We'll hop to the top end of the scale. We have a Bentley Continental GT, a very lovely car. Again, we've had a meeting of the scoring committee, and they've decided that colour is an 8, so it could be perhaps a little bit better. Maybe they prefer a matte rather than a gloss colour, but it's almost, it's not far away from ideal. Brand attractiveness, you can't get that much better than a Bentley, and performance, it goes pretty quick, that thing. So yeah, it's got 10 on both of those. Now, before we can use these scores, we've got to go back and use our weights. So what we do is we multiply each one of these numbers by our weight. So the weight is a third, so we'll multiply the 10 by a third, the 10 by a third, and the 8 by a third, and we'll sum all of that up. That gives us one single number. We do that for every option. It's that simple. That's all the maths that's involved in this. And this allows us to plot the each of those options on a graph. And we can plot it against cost as well. And this becomes quite revealing when you put the cost dimension in. At the moment, this is plotted purely against purchase cost, but that could be any cost. That could be whole life costs, so you could factor in the fuel that you're likely to use for the duration that you'll own that car. You could factor in the insurance costs. You could factor in everything to do with the cost of ownership of that option. You could look at even other ownership models like renting. You could look at, well, if we're only going to use the car for a day a week, is it better to rent, etc. All of this work applies however you put that option together. But at the moment, we're assuming that we just pay the full purchase price for that option. So what we see here is, of course, the Bentley does extremely well. The Volkswagen is certainly above the minimum acceptable, so that's absolutely fine. The Trabant is, as we would expect, well below the red line, the minimum acceptable line. This form of analysis, as it's presented right now, would fail scrutiny if you were to present it to an independent scrutineer in the public sector. But for the simple reason that you're essentially railroading the purchasers into buying the Volkswagen. So in the public sector, you're not going to get the Bentley, no chance, not in a million years. And the Trabant's out because you've already ruled it out. That leaves you with one viable option. So this, as it's presented here, this is not squeaky clean analysis. This is simply a demonstration of what you can do. In reality, of course, what you'd be expecting to see is a whole range of options. Those things that are cheaper than the Bentley that might sort of be really good options, but nowhere near as expensive. You'd be expecting to see those things that are maybe a little less capable than the Volkswagen, but still just above that minimum acceptable line. So there's a whole lot of options that sort of still need to go on here. But for the purposes of illustration, this just shows a way of being able to compare sort of apples and oranges. So just going back to that original slide, you're able to take in three quantities which don't lend themselves to being sort of analysed scientifically, and you're able to apply a modicum of scientific analysis to break that down. Once you've applied a really rigorous approach to the way that you've weighted and scored this, you've got a genuinely robust defence for buying whatever you think is important to buy, which would probably be in the public sector, something that's just above that minimum acceptable line. There would be a need, of course, to check for niche weaknesses, that you're not sort of, you don't have any particular holes in this. But this is a really useful way of being able to make decisions. So MCDA, multi-criteria decision analysis, it's really powerful, very useful. I use it all the time. That leads us then to generally decision making. How does decision making sort of get delivered within any organisation, particularly within the public sector? Well, on the left-hand side of this, we've got quite an amount of rationality. We've got an amount of emotion and politics, but not very much. As we move to the right of this, we get decisions that are dominated by emotion and politics. And there are lots of those. I mean, in political life, I mean, the sort of, the decisions about who to elect as a politician, decisions about sort of, who you would vote for as a future MP. There's not necessarily much rationality there in terms of, how can you compare what one politician has delivered in power versus all the other contenders who've never held a political post, for example, if you're voting for an MP. When we looked at the Brexit vote, people tried to bring in some rationality to it, but most of that got shot down once the sort of tests of, does this actually occur, sort of came to bear. So the £350 million that Boris was always talking about per week turned out not to be particularly true. So the amount of rationality was very minimal in that, and this was very much around emotion and politics, where we individually see the UK and what we see the European Union as. So many decisions are very much more into the centre and to the right of this than we perhaps expect. We like to believe that all decisions are made using perfect rationality in the public sector. We wouldn't want to waste public money by doing things that are irrational. But actually, that can be not necessarily the case. And so the important thing to consider in decision making is, of course, the material world in terms of the rationality, the personal world in terms of emotion, and the political world in terms of the social world. How does all this fit together? So those three worlds from Habermas are immensely important as we start to journey into decision making. There's a whole lot more about decision making and how we can work in that political environment in the course. So you've met the sort of one of the course leaders, where you've seen an overview of a couple of the other sort of team members who deliver the course. I'll also just finish off my part of this presentation by talking about two of the people we bring in as guest speakers to this course. So Professor Colin Eden is an absolute mine of information. He's been very much a pioneer of decision making. So going back to that the graph I showed you a moment ago of the politics, the emotion and the rationality, Colin has built over the years tools which have walked that journey beautifully. He spends quite a lot of his time now making decisions of multi-billion-pound sort of importance, or quite often he's working across the world, so multi-billion-dollar importance. He's settled a great many legal disputes using these tools because they get people down to the crux of what's really needed. Colin delivers the most fascinating session on how to make decisions in that really complex and really difficult environment, and how to cut to the chase, to get away from all the noise and all the distractions, how to cut to the chase of what you really need. Professor Jonathan Rosenhead has had the most fantastic career. He spent quite a lot of time in the London School of Economics, but he's certainly not an ivory tower type academic. Jonathan's worked in the real world. He talks about optimizing the health system and how you can do that, and what approaches work to optimization in healthcare within the UK. Again, his presentation is absolutely fantastic. Jonathan is co-author of the course textbook, and he's been very much focusing on dealing with uncertainty. We work all the time with uncertainty, so his sessions are again immensely interesting. At that point, I will hand over to Richard, who will talk you through the systems thinking courses. So, sorry, different Richard Burgess this time.
Thank you, Martin. Just a few slides from me. We're nearly at the end of the presentation, and then we'll have some time for questions after that. In terms of systems thinking, we can offer systems thinking as short courses for groups of people or in person. So it could be introduction to systems thinking or masterclasses for the various systems such as soft systems methodology or the viable system model. Just let us know what you're interested in and we can give you a quote. Next slide, please. In terms of the apprenticeship, we're the first training provider to have offered the standard. We launched in July of 2021. So we'll actually be having our first learners going to endpoint assessment this year. And there's a quote there from Louise Booth, who was one of the first people onto program, who's an NHS program manager and a systems thinker. So you can read that yourself, but I'll read through it. It's fitted everything I wanted to do. It's about how you work as a wider system. It's about different strategies, different approaches. It's about getting the best out of things for most people. And it really does have that different lens. It's thinking about things from a different systems point of view. Next slide. So, and the feedback we've had is that the apprentices appreciate that they can apply their learning immediately. It solves real world problems. And each presentation on the programme is adjusted for the types of complex problem that they face at work. And the monthly sessions are an opportunity to talk in confidence with our highly experienced skills coaches about key work challenges. Next slide, please. In terms of the apprenticeship training itself, so the training phase which JJ delivers is a 21-month phase, which is accelerated. We have tutor-led seminars that are led by Martin and monthly one-to-one time with a skills coach. We ask the line managers attend coaching sessions for 10 to 15 minutes, just so we can give them an informal update. And then there are formal progress reviews which take place during the course of the apprenticeship. There'll be quite a lot of self-study, and we'll also encourage all our learners to put the learning into practice right from the beginning. We can roll learners into program with a number of online sessions, and typically we do this every 2 months or so. We'll put together a workplace development plan, which is the single record, if you like, for all the on-the-job and off-the-job training, and will help to individualise the apprenticeship as much as we possibly can for their requirements and the requirements of the organisation they're working for, as well as ensuring that we meet all the skills, knowledge and behavioural elements of the standard. Next slide, please. So here are the different, in terms of these points here, these are the different subject areas that we cover in terms of the apprenticeship. So we start off with knowing the self, key personality preferences. We'll look at systems, people and complexity. Then we'll move on to personality, stakeholders and assumptions. We'll look at information and evidence. We'll look at modelling and simulation and some of the systems modelling tools, which we've just looked at very briefly this afternoon. And we'll look at multi-methodology and then leadership, because that's very important in delivering systems thinking. We'll look at planning and delivery of successful interventions, leading change, and also personal resilience. Next slide, please. So in terms of the independent assessment, that will be through advanced HE. So the gateway, as we call it, is 3 months before assessment. That's a catch-all term to ensure that the learners have reached the 100% of the learning aims in terms of skills, knowledge and behaviours, and have also reached the number of hours required for the programme. There'll be a project report and a presentation based on a project and portfolio of evidence of knowledge, skills and behaviours. So the two things you'll be assessed on at endpoint assessment are a project and a report on a project, and Q&A based on that project and project presentation, and then also a professional discussion based upon the portfolio that you've submitted of your work. Next slide, please. So these are our contact details. You can either phone John, who's here somewhere, on our landline. There's our sales@jga-group.co.uk, or you can click in there and have a read on our website about what's involved in greater detail. You can look at our social media platforms. We've got LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter. LinkedIn's probably the platform with the most activity, I'd say. Next slide, please. So at this point, ask if there's any questions. So right now, I think we just had one from Ross, who's asking if there are some soft criteria, such as brand attractiveness, may have proxy measures such as resale value, which can put them into the realms of the harder scoring in terms of the cars you were talking about earlier. Unfortunately, there's not a great deal of resale value in public sector projects that I can think of, but maybe Martin, you can think of something.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a very good point. So in the piece, I'll just sit back as I'm talking to the set of criteria that we were using, and what we've tried hard to do here is to separate out the financial from the non-financial criteria. So resale value would come into the financial criteria. So instead of plotting, so what we've got here at the moment is sort of three elements that are non-financial. So this is about the sort of, how well this option will deliver against the criteria that are needed. We'll then bring it together with cost right here. And what we could do is we could make that any cost. I sort of mentioned this was just really a very simple sort of graph just to demonstrate the concept, but that could be whole life cost. So it could include all the servicing, the resale value. It could include the cost of maintenance. It could include the fuel, the everything in that option. So you could say it's the whole life cost of ownership. You would be making a whole lot of assumptions. You'd be making assumptions about how far you would drive that car, about the likely maintenance that would be needed for that sort of distance of drive. But yes, you could include it, and resale value would definitely go in there. So it generally would go into the cost area as a sort of variable. So you try and keep the sort of the surrogate, the measure of merit, which is a surrogate for measure of effectiveness, away from the cost axis where you possibly can. But yeah, absolutely good point. It could very easily go in there.
Right, are there any other questions at all coming through?
We can bring people on if you'd like to come on and ask your question. You're very welcome to. We've got a few minutes still.
I think we provided quite a bit of food for thought. So
Yes.
needs to be digested first before the questions come. As I was saying before, if you do have any questions regarding the program, you can email that sales at email address, and it will reach one of us to answer you.